The night had already settled into a deep, impenetrable darkness as I lay in my bed, the echoes of the day's monotony still buzzing faintly in my mind. The role of an incident response manager for the London Underground, while critical, was often draped in the dull hues of routine and red tape. The Metropolitan line, with its creaking joints and the size of age-old tracks, had become a backdrop to my everyday life, a scene so familiar yet distant in my heart. But that night, as the clock hands joined in silent prayer for the forgotten hours, my room was pierced by the shrill cry of the emergency pager. It was a sound that I had grown accustomed to, yet each call nudged a sense of foreboding deep within me. This time, the feeling was different. It clung to me, a cold, damp cloak that I couldn't shake off. With heavy limbs and a heavier heart, I peeled myself from the sheets, the remnants of sleep clinging desperately to my senses. The city outside my window lay silent, a stark contrast to the usual hum of life that filled the streets of London. It was as if the world had inhaled deeply and was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. The journey to the station was a blur, the streets empty, with only the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight to guide my way. The closer I got, the more the city seemed to retreat, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing unease that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. As I stepped onto the platform, the usual comforting familiarity of the underground was replaced with an unsettling stillness. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long shadows that danced mockingly at the edges of my vision. The air felt thicker here, charged with an unspoken tension that made each step feel like a descent into unknown depths. The control room was in disarray, a stark deviation from the meticulous order I was accustomed to. Monitors flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow on the faces of the staff who moved about with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. The usual greetings were absent, replaced by hurried whispers and fleeting glances. Something was amiss, something beyond the usual mechanical failures and delays. I was briefed in hushed tones about the situation. A train on the Metropolitan line, my line, had ceased all movement and communication between stations. There was no explanation, no logical reason for the sudden silence that had fallen over the line like a shroud. It was my job, my duty, to find out why. With a heavy heart, I stepped onto the service train, the vehicle that would carry me into the bowels of the city, into the heart of the unknown. The doors closed with a finality that echoed ominously through the empty carriage, and as the train lurched forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was moving deeper into a nightmare, far removed from the monotonous safety of my daily existence. The journey into the bowels of London's underground was a descent not just into the physical darkness of the city's underbelly, but into a psychological abyss that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. The service train, normally a vessel of routine and familiarity, now felt like a chariot ferrying me towards an unknown fate. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks, a sound that usually signified movement and life, now echoed ominously, mirroring the racing beats of my own heart. As we tunneled deeper, the last vestiges of London's nocturnal glow faded into the consuming blackness outside my window. The interior lights of the carriage flickered, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the empty seats and empty faces of the few staff members accompanying me. Their usual banter was absent, replaced by an uneasy silence that filled the space between us with unsaid fears and unasked questions. The farther we traveled, the more the weight of the underground seemed to press down upon us. Walls streaked with the tears of countless journeys streaked past, a blur of sorrow and time that seemed to whisper of untold stories and forgotten nightmares. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of damp and decay that spoke of the Metropolitan line's age and the secrets it kept cradled in its depths. Arriving at the site of the incident, the train slowed to a halt, its usual smooth stop replaced by a hesitant, jerky motion, as if reluctant to bring us to our destination. The platform, usually a hive of activity and life, was deserted, a ghost town that echoed with the memories of passengers long gone. The only sounds were the distant drips of water and the soft hiss of the train's doors sliding open, an invitation to step into the unknown. Stepping onto the platform, the sense of isolation was immediate and overwhelming. The usual vibrancy of the underground was absent, replaced by a suffocating stillness that seemed almost tangible. The tunnel ahead, usually a beacon of transit and movement, loomed like the mouth of a giant beast, dark and foreboding. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, a solitary ray of light in a world that had seemingly forgotten the sun. The control room had been abandoned in haste, papers strewn across desks, screens flickering with the ghostly remnants of unfinished tasks. The chaos was a silent testament to the urgency and fear that had precipitated our arrival. As I moved towards the mouth of the tunnel, the stillness of the air felt like a heavy cloak, each step forward a defiance against an unseen force that whispered of turning back, of leaving the mysteries of the dark untouched. But duty propelled me forward, into the mouth of the tunnel, into the heart of the darkness. The light from my torch seemed feeble against the oppressive blackness, a lone soldier battling against an army of shadows. The silence of the tunnel was a physical thing, pressing against my eardrums, a suffocating absence of sound that seemed to scream louder than any noise. And then, there it was, the train, a hulking mass of metal and mystery, sitting silent and ominous on the tracks. Its usually vibrant exterior was dulled by the shadows, transforming it into a monolithic creature of the dark, a silent sentinel of the unknown. The realization that I was about to step into this silent behemoth to uncover the secrets it held filled me with a dread that was palpable, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach that threatened to engulf me. Yet, propelled by a sense of duty and a haunting curiosity, I moved forward, each step taking me deeper into the unfolding mystery, deeper into the heart of darkness that awaited within the silent carriages of the Metropolitan line. Crossing the threshold into the silent train, the contrast between the lively city I had left behind and this lifeless carriage couldn't have been more stark. The dim lighting within cast an otherworldly glow, creating shadows that seemed to flicker and move of their own accord. The air was stale, heavy with a silence so profound it felt like an entity in itself, a suffocating blanket that smothered all sound. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, the scene before me unfolded in surreal clarity. The passengers, an array of men and women from all walks of life, stood motionless, their backs to me, facing the grimy walls of the carriage. They were statuesque, frozen in time and place, an eerie tableau that defied logic and reason. My voice, calling out to them, sounded alien in the oppressive silence, bouncing off the walls and returning to me as if rebuffed by the very air. Moving cautiously down the aisle, I reached out to touch a shoulder, a tentative gesture met with cold, unyielding stillness. There was no response, no flinch, no acknowledgement of my presence. It was as if they were all lost in a trance, a collective state of suspended animation that none could break. The normal signs of life, the rise and fall of a chest, the blink of an eye, the slightest twitch, were all conspicuously absent, leaving a chilling void where humanity should have been. The driver's cabin, my next destination, promised answers but harbored my deepest fears. As I approached, the sense of wrongness intensified, a crescendo of dread that filled the space around me. The door, typically a barrier to the uninitiated, stood ajar, an ominous invitation into the unknown. Inside, the cabin was shrouded in darkness, the only light emanating from the flickering displays casting ghastly shadows across the interior. Tony, the driver, a man whose laughter had filled many a dreary morning, sat facing away from me, an unnaturally still figure in the dim light. Calling his name, I reached out, a gesture born of a desperate hope for normalcy. But when he turned, the world as I knew it shattered. His face, once so full of life and warmth, was now a mask of horror, his eyes gone. Hollow sockets stared back at me, a silent scream that echoed the terror clawing at my soul. The sight was a physical blow, sending me staggering back, my mind reeling from the impossible, the unthinkable. The cabin, once a place of control and safety, was now a chamber of nightmares, a tomb of lost souls. The realization that the train, this closed, inescapable space, was no longer in the realm of the known, that we had somehow crossed into a landscape of horror and madness, was overwhelming. With every fiber of my being screaming to flee to escape the suffocating horror of the silent carriage, I turned, only to be met with the blank, lifeless stares of the passengers. They had turned, as if on cue, their empty eyes fixed on me. A collective judgment passed from the depths of oblivion. The train, a silent, dead thing of metal and mystery, had become a prison, a holding cell for the damned. And I, by some cruel twist of fate, had become its newest inmate. The horror of the situation, the complete and utter isolation amidst a sea of people, pressed down on me with a physical weight, a burden of dread so intense it threatened to crush the very life from me. The urge to run, to break free from the nightmare that ensnared me, was a tidal wave of panic that filled every corner of my being. But the silent watchers blocked my way, a barrier of flesh and emptiness that stood between me and the world of the living. In that moment, trapped in the silent carriage with the unseeing eyes of the lost bearing down upon me, I knew true terror. In that moment, time seemed to stand still, the world outside the train ceasing to exist, leaving only the suffocating reality of the carriage and its silent, watchful occupants. The air around me felt charged, electric with a palpable sense of impending doom that I could almost taste, a bitter tang of fear and desperation. Then, without warning, the train lurched, a violent shudder that ran through its length like a convulsion of some great, slumbering beast. The lights flickered, casting the carriage into a series of rapid, stroboscopic snapshots of horror. In the brief moments of darkness between flashes, the world seemed to shift, reality bending in ways that my mind struggled to comprehend. From the shadows of the tunnel, a presence made itself known. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form. A swirling mass of shadows that seeped into the carriage like smoke from a smoldering fire. The temperature dropped precipitously, breaths visible in the air, a chilling herald of the nightmare that was to unfold. The passengers, those silent sentinels of despair, began to change. It was subtle at first, a slight contortion of a limb, a twitch of a head, but then more pronounced, more horrific. Their faces, once blank and lifeless, twisted into grotesque masks of anguish and terror, a silent chorus of the damned that no human should ever witness. Yet their eyes remained empty, voids that reflected no light, no life, no soul. Amidst this macabre transformation, the shadowy entity moved with purpose, a deliberate, malevolent force that seemed to feed on the fear and chaos it wrought. Its form was ever-changing, a fluid nightmare that defied the laws of physics and sanity, a dark specter of all that is unholy and wrong. The panic that had been simmering within me erupted into a visceral, primal fear, a terror so profound that it threatened to engulf my very being. My body moved of its own accord, a puppet driven by the most basic instinct known to any living creature: survival. Yet, as I turned to flee, to escape the unfolding horror, I found myself face to face with the entity, the heart of the darkness that had consumed the train and its occupants. Its face, if it could be called that, was a melangetic vortex, a swirling abyss that seemed to pull at the very essence of my soul, a void where hope, light, and life were devoured whole. In its presence, I felt small, insignificant, a mere speck of dust caught in the gravitational pull of a black hole from which there was no escape. The world around me became distant, sounds muffled as if underwater, the screams of the transformed passengers fading into the background. All that existed was the entity and the overwhelming sense of dread it exuded, a palpable malevolence that seemed to say, "You are mine." But even in the face of this ultimate terror, a spark of defiance flickered within me, a refusal to succumb to the darkness. With every ounce of willpower I could muster, I tore my gaze from the abyssal eyes of the entity, the action of physical effort akin to pulling myself from quicksand. The train, the passengers, the very air around me screamed of despair and surrender, but I would not give in. Not yet. With a desperate, gasping effort, I turned and forced my legs to move, to carry me away from the epicenter of nightmare and towards the faintest glimmer of hope. The possibility of escape from the unearthly encounter that sought to claim me as its own. My escape from the train was a blur of terror and instinct, a frenzied dash through a world transformed into a tableau of nightmares. The carriage, once familiar, was now a labyrinth of horror, each twist and turn a potential trap, every shadow a hiding place for unspeakable terrors. The transformed passengers, once human, now seemed like grotesque, twisted caricatures of their former selves, their silent screams a haunting refrain that followed me as I ran. The air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread, as if the very atmosphere had been corrupted by the unearthly presence that had invaded our reality. My lungs burned with the effort of breathing, each gasp a painful reminder of the fight for survival that I was engaged in. The dim, flickering lights above provided scant illumination, casting eerie, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes, making me see movements and shapes where there were none. Finally, I reached the door at the end of the carriage, my hands shaking so violently that it took several attempts to grasp the handle. The door slid open with a reluctant groan, as if it too were reluctant to let me leave the scene of such unspeakable horror. The platform beyond was deserted, a stark, empty space that offered no comfort, no sense of safety, only the bleak reality of my situation. I stumbled out onto the platform, my legs weak and unsteady from the adrenaline that coursed through my veins. Behind me, the train stood silent, a dark monument to the nightmare I had just escaped. The urge to keep moving was overwhelming, a primal instinct that drove me away from the train, away from the darkness and the horrors it contained. The journey back to the surface was a torturous ascent, each step taking me further from the nightmare below, yet bringing no sense of relief. The station was deserted, the usual hustle and bustle of city life absent in the early hours of the morning. The silence was oppressive, a stark reminder of the isolation that enveloped me, the weight of what I had experienced pressing down on me with a suffocating force. The aftermath of the incident was a haze of reports, interviews, and sleepless nights. The official explanation was a gas leak, a mundane cause for the hallucinations that they claimed had plagued me and the other passengers. But I knew the truth. The missing persons reports for Tony and the 15 passengers, filed and then quietly forgotten, were a testament to the reality of that night. The decision to leave my job came easily. The underground no longer a place of employment, but a site of trauma. A place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown had been irrevocably blurred. My resignation was a silent scream, a final act of defiance against the darkness that had sought to claim me. I left London soon after, the city itself a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked beneath its streets. The memories of that night followed me, haunting dreams that left me waking in terror. The echoes of silent screams and the vision of eyeless faces etched into my mind. The Metropolitan line continues to operate, its trains carrying unsuspecting passengers beneath the streets of London, through the darkness that I know all too well. I find no comfort in the normalcy of life that has continued around me, a stark contrast to the chaos and horror that changed me forever. I live with the knowledge of what exists in the shadows, of the terrors that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. The experience has left me changed, haunted by the memories and the profound sense of unease that accompanies the realization that there are things in this world that defy explanation, horrors that lie in wait in the silent carriages of the London Underground.